The wind in Sheridan, Wyoming, had teeth in November of 1883, and it bit with the spite of a cornered animal. It howled down the unpaved Main Street, kicking up dust and the ghost of summer's heat, but carrying a cold so deep it felt like it came from the bones of the earth itself. The sky was the color of a dirty tin plate, promising snow that would bury, not bless. Catherine Hale pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter, one hand shielding her face while the other clutched the handle of an empty wicker basket. The cold was a physical weight, but the hollowness in her stomach was heavier still. It was a mirror to the basket she carried, an emptiness that gnawed at her resolve. Inside Morrison's mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and the sweet, cloying smell of dried apples in an open barrel. It was the smell of plenty, a scent that mocked her. Silas Morrison stood behind the long pine counter, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, his pen scratching in a ledger book. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a man of business, and the coming winter had made him like the wind, sharp and unforgiving. Catherine approached the counter, placing her empty basket on its surface. The sound was soft, but in the tense quiet of the store, it seemed to echo a few women, wives of ranchers and merchants. Paused their shopping to watch. Their silence was a form of judgment. She kept her voice low, a private plea in a public space. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask for a little more on credit, just until the trapping season picks up. My late husband, Thomas, he always settled up come spring." Morrison did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the columns of numbers, his pen poised. "I am sorry, Catherine. The book is closed. Winter orders have come in. I cannot extend any more." "Please, Silas, just some flour. A bit of salt pork for Micah. He is only 6. Her voice cracked on her son's name, a betrayal of the composure she fought so hard to maintain. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, but its ghost still clawed at her throat. Morrison finally looked up, his eyes weary. He glanced at the other customers, then back at her. His voice was louder now. "For their benefit, I have told you, the book is closed. Pritchard at the bank has been very clear about outstanding accounts this season. My own family depends on this store. I can do no more." The finality of his words struck her like a slap. He had not just refused her. He had announced her poverty to the entire room. He had used the name Pritchard, the owner of the bank, the owner of half the county, as a shield. It was a name that carried the weight of law and foreclosure. Just then, the mercantile's door opened, letting in another blast of wind and a woman wrapped in a fine fur-trimmed coat. Amelia Pritchard, the banker's wife, stepped inside, her gaze sweeping the room with an air of ownership. She saw Catherine at the counter, the empty basket, the flush of shame on her cheeks. Amelia's lips tightened into a thin, virtuous line. "Some people," she said to no one in particular, but loud enough for all to hear, "ought to learn to live within their means. Providence does not reward idleness, especially in a widow." The barb found its mark. Catherine flinched, her hands trembling as she picked up her basket. She would not give them the satisfaction of tears. She turned, her back straight, and walked toward the door, the silence of the store pressing in on her. A man had been standing just inside the doorway, leaning against a stack of feed sacks, a silent observer to the whole miserable scene. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical, trail-worn clothes. His hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over a face that was weathered but not unkind. He had been watching, his eyes missing nothing. As Catherine pushed the door open, the wind tore at her shawl. She felt the eyes of the town on her, felt the weight of her failure, her inability to feed her own child. She took a step out onto the wooden boardwalk, her vision blurred. The man stepped out from under the awning, moving into her path. He was not hurried. His movements were deliberate, calm. He looked at her, then at the empty basket, and his voice, when he spoke, was low and steady. It was not a voice of pity. It was a voice of promise. "Come with me." He said it not as a question, but as a simple, undeniable statement. "I will fill your table tonight." Catherine stared at him. He was a stranger. Cowboys passed through Sheridan all the time, their pockets full one day and empty the next. They were sources of trouble, not salvation. She clutched her basket tighter, suspicion warring with a desperate, rising tide of hope. Why, she managed to whisper. He did not answer her question directly. Instead, he simply nodded back toward the store. "Let us get what you need." He held the door for her, and she found herself walking back into the mercantile, the scene of her humiliation. The other customers stared, their whispers now buzzing with fresh speculation. Amelia Pritchard watched with narrowed eyes, her disapproval a palpable force. The stranger walked to the counter, Catherine a half step behind him. He ignored everyone else. His focus was on Morrison, who looked flustered, his face a mixture of surprise and unease. "The woman needs supplies," the cowboy said. "Flour, a 10-pound sack, a side of salt pork, a bag of pinto beans and another of sugar, dried apples." His gaze flickered to Catherine. "Anything else?" She thought of Micah, of the small, simple joys he had been denied for so long. "Peppermint," she said, her voice barely audible. "He likes peppermint candy." "And a bag of peppermint candy," the man added, his eyes meeting Morrison's. Morrison began to move, pulling items from the shelves, his movements jerky. The stranger reached into his worn leather coat and pulled out a small deerskin pouch. He loosened the drawstring and poured a cascade of silver coins and folded bills onto the counter. The sound was a defiant clang in the quiet room. "Cash," the cowboy said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "There are no strings on this. It is not a loan. It is not for your ledger." Morrison's face flushed a deeper red. He quickly calculated the total, his hands fumbling slightly. He bagged the goods, his eyes avoiding Catherine's. The heavy sacks of flour and beans felt like treasure in her arms. The weight was real, a solid answer to the gnawing emptiness. As Morrison handed her the small paper bag of peppermint sticks, their fingers brushed. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of shame. They walked out of the store, leaving a wake of stunned silence. The stranger's horse, a sturdy-looking buckskin, was tied to the hitching post. He expertly tied the sacks of supplies behind his saddle. The walk back to her small homestead on Goose Creek was a quiet one. He led his horse, walking beside her, matching his long strides to her shorter ones. The wind was still fierce, but the weight of the food in the sacks on his horse felt like an anchor, holding her to the earth. "It is a hard thing to ask for help," he said after a long silence. His voice carried on the wind. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "It is a harder thing to be denied when your child is hungry," he continued, looking straight ahead at the bleak horizon. This simple acknowledgement of her truth, spoken without judgment, loosened the knot of shame in her chest. He understands, she thought. He was not just giving charity, he was giving dignity. They walked on. The only sounds the crunch of their boots on the frozen ground and the rhythmic plodding of the horse. "You should be careful," he said then, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious. "I have seen this before. A hard winter comes, ranchers are overextended. The banks start calling in notes, buying up debt from the merchants." Catherine looked at him, surprised by his sudden insight. "How did you know about the bank?" He shrugged, his gaze sweeping over the barren landscape. "It is a pattern. A man with enough money and not enough conscience can gather up a lot of land that way. They squeeze the small folks until they have no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar, or sign away their water rights just to get through the winter. Do not sign anything that comes from Pritchard's bank, not without having Dr. Harrison or someone you trust read it first." He did not say the name Pritchard with malice, just a flat, factual certainty. He was warning her. This stranger, this quiet cowboy, had seen the trap she was walking into. a trap she had not even known existed. The refusal at the store was not just about Silas Morrison's empty coffers. It was a piece of a much larger, colder plan. When they reached her small cabin, it looked even more vulnerable against the vast, gray sky. The fences were leaning, in need of mending. The smoke rising from the chimney was a thin, pale thread, barely visible. It was a picture of a life hanging on by that same thin thread. He untied the sacks and carried them to her small porch, setting them down gently. He made no move to come inside, respecting the unspoken boundary of her home. The smell of pine smoke and damp earth hung in the air. The cabin door creaked open, and a small boy with wide, serious eyes and a tangle of brown hair peered out. Micah. His gaze went from his mother to the tall stranger, to the bulging sacks on the porch. Catherine knelt and pulled him into a hug, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. "We have food, my love. We have food for tonight." Micah looked at the stranger, his expression a mixture of awe and shyness. The man tipped his hat slightly. "Hello there, young man." "Will you come back?" Micah asked, his voice small but clear. The question hung in the cold air. It was a child's simple, hopeful query, but it felt immense. Catherine held her breath. The stranger had done more than enough. He owed them nothing more. He looked from the boy to the sparse woods that bordered her property, where the cottonwood trees stood like skeletal sentinels. "I reckon the rabbits are getting hungry, too. It would be a good morning to set some snares. I will come by after sunrise, if that is all right with your mother." Catherine found her voice. "Yes, that would be very welcome. Thank you." He just nodded, swung himself up into his saddle with an easy grace, and turned his horse back toward the town. Catherine and Micah watched until he was just a small, dark shape against the dying light, a promise of help in a world that had offered none. She carried the supplies inside, the scent of flour and sugar and dried apples filling her small home, a powerful magic against the encroaching dark and the biting wind. The basket on her table was no longer empty. The predicted snow arrived before dawn, a silent, weightless fall that dusted the world in a thin coat of white. It was not a storm, but a quiet promise of the deep winter to come. Catherine was awake long before the first pale light touched the windows, her mind a restless sea. She had slept fitfully, the reality of a full pantry warring with a lifetime of guarded self-reliance. The food was a comfort, but the man who provided it was a question she could not answer. True to his word, she saw his shape emerge from the gray morning mist just as the sun was cresting the eastern hills. He was on foot, carrying a small bundle of twine and a long knife sheathed at his belt. He moved with a purpose that seemed as natural as the sunrise itself. Micah was already awake, his face pressed against the cold glass of the single window, his breath fogging the pain. "He is here, Mama! He is really here!" Catherine opened the door before he could knock. The air was crisp and clean, the scent of snow and pine filling her lungs. "Good morning," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Morning, Catherine." Young Micah. Silas gave a small nod, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked at the boy. The smell of frying cornmeal and coffee drifted out from the cabin, a welcoming beacon in the cold. She had been up for an hour, mixing a batch of Johnny cakes from the new flour and cornmeal. It was a simple meal, but after weeks of thin broth and stale bread, it felt like a feast. She gestured him inside. "Come in and warm yourself. Breakfast is almost ready." He stamped the snow from his boots on the porch steps before entering, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. The cabin was small, just a single room with a sleeping loft, but Catherine kept it meticulously clean. The fire in the stone hearth cast a warm, flickering glow on the rough-hewn wooden walls. Silas sat at the small table, his large frame making the furniture seem like a child's. Micah scrambled onto the chair opposite him, his eyes wide with admiration. Catherine served the steaming Johnny cakes onto tin plates, adding a small dollop of molasses from a jar she'd been saving for a special occasion. This, she decided, was one. They ate in a comfortable silence at first, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scrape of forks on plates. Micah, however, devoured his food with the uninhibited speed of a hungry 6-year-old. Silas watched him, a slow smile touching his lips. "You eat that so fast, I wager you do not even have time to taste it." Micah paused, his mouth full, and looked at Silas with profound seriousness. "I taste it. It is good." He swallowed. "If I eat fast, it gets to my belly faster. That is where the hungry is." The simple, irrefutable logic of a child made Catherine's heart ache. Silas chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Well, I cannot argue with that. Just be sure to leave some room. Rabbit stew is mighty fine on a cold day." After the plates were cleared, Silas stood and retrieved the twine he had left on the porch. "The sun is up. The tracks will be clear in this new snow. Ready to learn something? Micah." The boy's face lit up. He pulled on his worn coat and mittens, his small body buzzing with excitement. Catherine watched them go, the tall man and the small boy, their figures stark against the white landscape as they headed for the line of cottonwood trees near the creek. She felt a strange pang in her chest, a feeling she could not name. It was not fear, not exactly. It was more like the feeling of a long frozen river beginning to thaw. Out in the quiet woods, the world was hushed and white. Silas moved slowly, his eyes scanning the ground. He knelt, pointing to a series of small, paired tracks in the snow. "See here, this is a cottontail." He was moving fast. "See how the prints from his back feet are in front of the prints from his front feet." He was bounding. Micah knelt beside him, his gaze intent. Silas showed him how to find a rabbit run, a narrow path they used regularly through the underbrush. He demonstrated how to tie a simple snare loop with the twine, anchoring it to a sturdy sapling and positioning it at just the right height to catch a rabbit's head. He did not just set the traps. He explained the logic behind each step, his voice patient and calm. "This is not just about catching dinner," he told the boy. "It is about understanding the world around you, knowing how to read the signs it gives you. An animal, the weather, even a man, they all leave tracks. You just have to learn how to see them." He was giving her son more than food. He was giving him knowledge, a tool for survival that no banker could take away. He was giving him the kind of lesson a father would. The thought ambushed Catherine as she watched them from the cabin window, and she quickly turned away, busying herself with stoking the fire. They returned 2 hours later, their cheeks flushed from the cold, carrying 3 plump rabbits. Silas showed Micah how to skin and clean them, his movements economical and precise, wasting nothing. He was respectful of the animals, a fact that Catherine noted and appreciated. When the work was done, she found her voice. "You should stay for lunch. It is the least I can do." Silas hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the propriety of the offer. Then he looked at Micah, who was watching him with undisguised hope, and he nodded. "I would like that very much. Thank you." While the stew simmered, filling the small cabin with a rich, savory aroma, a quiet awkwardness settled between them. They had shared breakfast and a hunt, but they were still strangers. Their lives 2 separate paths that had unexpectedly converged. Silas seemed to sense it. He reached into an inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, worn harmonica. He tapped it against his palm, then raised it to his lips. He began to play. Not a lively dance hall tune, but a slow, melancholic melody. It was a trail song, full of wide open spaces and lonely nights under the stars. The music filled the small cabin, smoothing over the rough edges of their silence, saying things that words could not. It spoke of hardship and endurance, of loss and a quiet, persistent hope. Catherine listened, her hands still in the bowl of flour she was kneading for bread. The music resonated with a part of her she had kept locked away since Thomas died, a part that remembered what it felt like to feel something other than grief and worry. When he finished, the last note hanging in the air like a sigh, she realized she had tears in her eyes. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "It is just a tune to pass the miles," he said, but he looked pleased. "Why are you doing this?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Why are you helping us?" Silas turned the harmonica over in his hands, his gaze distant. "I was leading a drive up from Texas a couple years back. Had a young hand with me, barely 17, full of life but green. A thunderstorm blew in one night, spooked the herd, a full-blown stampede. The boy, his horse went down. There was nothing anyone could do." He fell silent, the memory playing out in his eyes. "He died because I put him on night herd when he was not ready. I have sent my wages to his mother ever since. But it does not bring her boy back. She is a widow, too." He finally looked at Catherine, his gaze direct and clear. "When I saw you in that store yesterday, with your boy, I just figured I had a chance to do something right this time." The confession was simple, unadorned with any plea for sympathy. It was just a fact, a piece of his past that explained his present. He was not a saint or a savior. He was a man carrying a heavy weight, and helping her was, in some way, a method of balancing his own ledger. The knowledge settled her fears. His kindness was not charity. It was a form of penance. It was something she could understand, after they had eaten the rich, nourishing stew. Silas rose from the table. He walked to the door, but instead of leaving, he stood for a moment, looking up at the roofline. "That is a bad leak you have got starting over the wood pile," he said, his voice practical again. "And your gate is hanging by one hinge. The wind gets much worse. It will tear the whole post out." Catherine flushed. "I know. I have not had the time or the spare wood." "I have the time," he said, "and I saw a stand of good, straight pine down by the creek that would make a fine new gate-post. I am a fair hand with a hammer, not so good with a needle and thread. But I can fix a roof." He paused, as if choosing his next words with care. "A man gets tired of his own cooking in the livery stable bunkhouse. If you would be willing to trade a few hot meals for a few days of work, I would call it a fair bargain." He was offering her a way to accept his help without sacrificing her pride. It was not a gift, it was a transaction. Work for food, an equal exchange. The offer was so considerate, so attuned to her unspoken fears, that it almost brought tears to her eyes again. She looked at the sagging gate, at the dark, damp stain on the ceiling where the roof was failing. She thought of the long, hard winter ahead, of trying to face it all alone. And then she looked at this quiet, steady man who played sad songs on a harmonica and understood the language of animal tracks and human sorrow. "Townfolk will talk," she said, testing him. "Let them talk," he answered without hesitation. "Their words cannot patch a roof or keep the snow out." She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. The wall of defense she had built around herself since Thomas's death, a wall made of pride and necessity, felt impossibly thin. She could feel it cracking. "All right, Mr. Whitlow," she said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "It seems you have made a deal." "Silas Whitlow." He corrected her gently. "My name is Silas." He put on his hat. "I will be back tomorrow, then, to start patching up for winter." He nodded once, to her and then to Micah, and was gone. Catherine stood in the doorway and watched him walk away, his figure solid and reassuring against the vast, empty whiteness of the snow-covered land. She had said yes, and for the first time in a very long time. She felt a flicker not just of hope, but of something that felt dangerously like peace. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, measured not by the ticking of a clock but by the steady, percussive beat of Silas's hammer. The sound became a part of the landscape, as constant as the wind sighing through the pines and the gurgle of Goose Creek over its icy stones. He worked with a quiet, tireless efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. The leaky roof was the first to yield to his efforts. He stripped away the rotted shingles. Replacing them with new ones, he split himself from a fallen ponderosa, the sharp scent of fresh-cut wood perfuming the cold air. Micah appointed himself Silas's official apprentice. He ran back and forth with a seriousness that was both comical and touching, his small hands struggling to carry a single nail or a piece of kindling. He would stand for hours, his head cocked to one side, watching Silas's every move. Silas, in turn, treated him with a solemn respect. He would pause in his work to show Micah how to hold a hammer correctly, how to check if a board was level, or how to tie a knot that would not slip. He gave the boy small, important jobs, like stacking the leftover wood scraps or holding the end of a measuring rope. For Micah, who had known only the shadow of his father's long illness and his mother's quiet desperation, these days were a revelation. He was not just a boy to be fed and protected. He was a helper, a partner in the vital work of shoring up their world against the winter. After the roof was secure, Silas turned his attention to the ailing gate. He dug a new post hole in the frozen ground, his breath pluming in the air, and set a sturdy pine post that would stand against any Wyoming wind. He rehung the gate, adjusting the hinges until it swung smoothly shut with a satisfying click. He mended the leaning fences, repaired the drafty door so it no longer rattled in its frame, and reinforced the small lean-to that served as a shelter for their milk cow. Each nail driven was a small victory against the encroaching chaos. Each repaired board was a statement of order. Catherine would watch him from the cabin window as she cooked, a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. He was not just fixing her home. He was making it whole again. The arrangement was simple. He worked from sunup until the light failed, and she provided 3 hot meals a day. It was a fair trade, a partnership that allowed her to hold on to the last vestiges of her pride. But as the days turned into a week, the lines of their bargain began to blur. The evenings took on a life of their own. After supper, when Micah was asleep in the loft, they would sit by the fire. The silence between them no longer awkward, but companionable. He would talk about the long cattle drives, the vast, empty plains of Texas, the camaraderie of men who lived their lives in the saddle. She, in turn, found herself speaking of Thomas, of his gentle nature and his dreams that were always bigger than his practical skills. Sharing these memories did not feel like a betrayal. It felt like an acknowledgement of the life that had come before. A life that had brought her Micah and this small piece of land. After a week of this new routine, her supplies began to run low again. Not of the staples Silas had bought, but of the smaller necessities. She needed thread to mend Micah's worn coat and more salt for curing the last of the rabbits. Going to town was a necessity, but the thought of it filled her with a cold dread. Sheridan was no longer just a place of commerce. It was a stage where her life was being scrutinized. She went on a Tuesday, her basket on her arm, feeling the weight of unseen eyes from the moment she walked down the main street. Whispers seemed to follow her like stray dogs. When she came out of Morrison's Mercantile, having paid for her small purchases with one of the silver coins Silas had given her, she saw Amelia Pritchard standing by the post office, a sentinel of public opinion. Amelia had clearly been waiting for her. "Good day, Catherine," Amelia began, her voice as crisp and cold as the air. Her eyes flickered over Catherine's basket, noting its contents. "It is good to see you are managing so well. One hears things, of course." Catherine's stomach tightened. She knew what was coming. "And what does one hear, Amelia?" "One hears that you have taken in a guest, a strange man. A cowboy. It is not a proper situation for a grieving widow. People are concerned for your reputation, and for the influence on your young son." The words were wrapped in a cloak of false concern, but their points were sharp. "My son is being influenced to be hard-working and respectful," Catherine replied, her voice even. "And Mr. Whitlow is not a guest. He is a hired hand, working in exchange for his meals. It is a business arrangement. Nothing more." Amelia sniffed, a small, dismissive sound. "An arrangement. I see. It is a pity your husband did not leave you in a better position. To avoid such Arrangements. My husband left me with a fine son and a piece of land that is mine, free and clear, Catherine said, her chin rising. And as for what is proper, the law does not forbid a widow from hiring help to fix her roof, and I do not believe the Bible does either. Now, if you will excuse me, my son is waiting for me. She walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her head held high. She had not faltered. She had not let the woman's venom touch her. She had spoken the truth with a calmness she had not known she possessed. The small victory was exhilarating. Her confidence was short-lived. The next afternoon, a boy on a pony rode up to the cabin with a message. It was a folded note, sealed with the wax stamp of the Sheridan Bank and Trust. It was a polite, formally worded invitation from Mr. Enoch Pritchard himself, requesting her presence at the bank the following day to discuss a matter of mutual interest regarding her late husband's account. She showed the note to Silas that evening. He read it twice, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He handed it back to her. "What do you suppose he wants?" she asked, her anxiety returning. "He wants your land, Catherine," Silas said, his voice flat, or more likely, what is under it and flows through it. "He wants your water. But Thomas paid off the loan for the land itself. I have the deed. This is just for the seed loan from last spring. It is not so much." "It is enough," Silas said. "It is a foot in the door. He will be charming. He will be sympathetic. He will offer you a deal that sounds too good to be true. And it will be—" She went to the bank the next day, her hands cold with nerves. Enoch Pritchard's office was just as she had imagined it. It was a room designed to intimidate, with dark, polished wood, shelves of leather-bound books, and a large desk that served as a fortress. Pritchard himself was a stout man with a perfectly trimmed gray beard and eyes that were small and shrewd. He rose when she entered, his smile avuncular and kind. "Catherine, my dear, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to a plush leather chair. "Please, sit. I know this must be a difficult time for you, and I want you to know that the community and this bank are here to support you." He spoke for some time about his respect for her late husband, about the challenges of a Wyoming winter, about his duty as a pillar of the community. It was a masterful performance. Finally, he came to the point. He opened a large, heavy ledger on his desk, the pages filled with the neat, spidery script. A pencil lay next to it, a slender stick of wood and graphite that seemed to hold all the power in the room. "Your husband's outstanding loan," he said, tapping a line with his finger, "with the interest. It is a significant sum for a woman in your position. I have been thinking. I do not wish to add to your burdens, so I have a proposal. I am prepared to reduce the interest rate to almost nothing. We will extend the term of the loan, giving you years to repay it. It will ease your mind considerably." Catherine felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. It was an act of incredible kindness, but Silas's words echoed in her mind. She waited. "All I require," Pritchard continued, his voice smooth as honey, "is a small bit of additional collateral, just as a formality. A lien against your water rights to Goose Creek. It is just a piece of paper. My dear, it will ensure the bank is secure, and you will have the peace of mind you deserve." There it was, the hook inside the bait. The water. Goose Creek was the lifeblood of her land. Without it, the grass would wither, the cow would go dry. The small vegetable garden she planned for the spring would be impossible. The land itself would be worthless. "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "That is a very generous offer. I will need to think on it." Of course," he said, his smile never faltering. "Take all the time you need, but do not take too long. An offer like this, you understand, cannot stay on the table forever." She walked out of the bank and into the cold sunlight, feeling as though she had just escaped a perfectly disguised trap. That evening, she told Silas everything. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tight. "He is a patient wolf," Silas said when she had finished. He knows you are alone. He knows winter is coming. He thinks he can wait you out. So what do I do? You do nothing, Silas said. You do not sign a single thing. You make your payments as best you can, when you can. You hold on. That night, as they were washing the supper dishes in a basin of hot water, their hands brushed against each other under the soapy surface. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but a jolt went through her, sharp and unexpected. She pulled her hand back quickly. He did not move, but she saw something flicker in his eyes, a depth of emotion she had not seen before. He finished drying the last plate and hung the towel on its peg. He looked at her, his expression serious. Catherine, I know this is not an easy situation. I want you to know you have a friend in me. You and Micah, whatever happens. Friend? The word was safe. It was solid. It was also, she realized with a sudden, startling clarity, not entirely what she wanted, but it was what she needed. It was a boundary he was carefully drawing, a sign of respect for her, for the memory of her husband, for the precariousness of her world. Thank you, Silas, she said, her voice soft. I need a friend right now. A few days later, when Silas rode to town to get the mail, he returned with a letter of his own. It was from his sister, Rose, in Nebraska. He read it standing on the porch, a slow smile spreading across his face. Good news, Catherine asked. He looked up, his eyes bright. My sister, her husband, and the children. They are coming to visit in the spring. They want to see the mountains. The news brought a fresh wave of complicated feelings. It was a reminder that he had a life, a family, a world beyond this small cabin on Goose Creek. He was not a permanent fixture. He was a traveler, resting here for a season. The thought left a surprising ache in her chest. That is wonderful, she said, and she was surprised to find she meant it. A family visit. That will be something to look forward to. Yes, he said, folding the letter and tucking it carefully into his pocket. It will be. He looked out at the snow-covered fields, a wistful expression on his face. It will be good to have family around again. Catherine watched him and understood that in this small, battered cabin, two lonely people were daring to hope for the same thing. The change came on a Thursday. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue for days, took on a bruised, yellowish tint along the horizon. The wind, which had been a constant but predictable force, died down to an unsettling stillness. Silas, who was in the middle of splitting the last of a downed cottonwood for firewood, stopped his work, his axe held mid-swing. He sniffed the air, his gaze fixed on the unnatural calm. The animals know, he said, his voice low. He gestured with his chin toward the woods, where a flock of jays was raising a frantic, chattering alarm. Catherine came to the cabin door, wiping her hands on her apron. A storm. A bad one, I think, he said. This is not just snow. This is a blizzard. I had best get this wood stacked and see to your cow. I do not think I will be making it back to town tonight. The statement was practical, a simple assessment of the facts, but it landed in the small space between them with the weight of a stone. He would be staying, not just for supper, but through the night, through the storm. The unspoken rules of their arrangement were about to be rewritten by the weather. By late afternoon, the first flakes began to fall. Not the gentle, drifting flakes of the week before, but small, hard pellets driven by a rising wind. By dusk, the world outside their small window was a churning vortex of white. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, hungry sound. But inside, the new roof held firm. The repaired door did not rattle. The cabin, which had once felt so vulnerable, was now a small, tight ship in a raging sea, its warmth and light a defiant stand against the chaos. They ate their supper of rabbit stew and fresh bread, the sound of the storm a constant accompaniment. Micah was thrilled. To him, the storm was not a threat but a grand adventure, and having Silas trapped with them was the greatest part. After Catherine tucked him into his sleeping loft, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. The storm filled the silence, but it could not fill the space between the two of them. Without discussion, Silas took a spare blanket she offered and made a bed for himself on the floor by the hearth, as far from her own small bed as the single room would allow. It was a gesture of profound respect, a silent acknowledgement of her position, and she was grateful for it. She lay in her bed, listening to the twin sounds of the wind's fury and the steady, quiet breathing of the man sleeping by her fire, and felt a sense of security she had not known was possible. The storm raged for 3 days. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. Time itself seemed to slow, measured by the rhythm of their small, shared existence. In the mornings, Silas would tend the fire and check on the cow in its newly reinforced shelter. Catherine would cook. In the afternoons, to combat the endless hours, they would play cards, Silas patiently teaching Micah a simple game called War. He would let the boy win. And Micah's triumphant shouts were a welcome noise in the storm's oppressive silence. In the evenings, they talked. The enclosed space, the shared isolation, seemed to peel away the layers of caution and reserve. Silas spoke of the Chisholm Trail, of months spent under an endless sky with only cattle and other men for company. He described the terror of a stampede, the bone-deep weariness of a river crossing, the simple beauty of a sunrise over the plains. His stories were not boasts. They were plain-spoken accounts of a life of constant motion and profound loneliness. And Catherine, emboldened by his honesty, found herself talking about Thomas, not the idealized, sainted memory she presented to the world, but the real man, a good man, a kind man. She said, her hands busy mending a tear in Micah's shirt. But he was a dreamer. He saw a field and imagined a bounty, but he never quite figured out the part about plowing in a straight line. He bought a cow that gave no milk and traded our best mule for what he was told were magic beans. She smiled, a sad, fond smile. He had a beautiful heart. Silas, but it was not a practical one. This land, this cabin, it was his dream. I am just the one who has to figure out how to live in it. To speak the truth of her marriage aloud, with all its love and its frustrations, felt like a release. Silas did not offer platitudes or judgment. He just listened, his expression thoughtful, and in his listening, she felt a deep and comforting sense of being understood. They were 2 people from different worlds, a wanderer and a homesteader, but they both knew the weight of dreams, both their own and those of others. On the 3rd day, the wind finally began to subside. The snow stopped falling. A strange, bright silence descended on the world. They opened the door to a landscape transformed, a world buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The snow was drifted up to the windowsills, and the familiar shapes of the trees and fences were softened and made new. They were completely and utterly snowed in. The mood in the cabin shifted. The storm, their common enemy, was gone. Now it was just the 3 of them, in a small, quiet space. The unspoken feelings between the man and the woman as thick and deep as the snow outside. That evening, after Micah was asleep, the silence felt different. It was charged, expectant. Silas was sharpening his long skinning knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone the only sound. Catherine was staring into the fire, watching the flames dance. "I have been thinking," Silas said, breaking the quiet. He set the knife and stone aside. "This life on the trail, it is a young man's game. I'm getting too old to be sleeping on the ground every night." He looked around the small, warm cabin, at the sturdy roof above them, at the sleeping loft where the child lay safe. He looked at her. "I have been saving my wages for a long time," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Not just for that boy's mother. For myself, I have enough to buy a piece of land. A good piece. Start a small horse ranch. Maybe. Raise some good quarter horses, stop wandering." Catherine's heart began to beat a little faster. She did not know where this was going, but she knew it was important. "The thing is, a man can have land and horses. But that is not a home. It is just a place. I have had enough of just places. He met her gaze directly, his eyes clear and serious. I want to stop wandering, Catherine, but I need a reason to stay. If you give me a reason to stay. The words hung in the air between them. Simple, direct, and immense. He was not just talking about a piece of land anymore. He was talking about a future. He was talking about them. He was offering her a choice, a possibility she had not dared to even imagine. The weight of it, the hope of it, was terrifying and wonderful. She could not find the words to answer. Her throat was tight with 1,000 emotions. She stood up, needing air, and walked to the door, pulling it open. The cold air that rushed in was a shock, clean and sharp against her flushed cheeks. She stepped out onto the small porch, into a world of impossible beauty. A full moon had risen, and it cast a brilliant silver light on the endless sea of snow. The world was silent, still, and perfect. Silas followed her out. He stood beside her, not touching, just sharing the silence. The steam of their breath mingled in the frigid air. "Silas," she began, her voice a whisper. He turned to her then. He reached out, not to embrace her, but to gently cup her face with his calloused hand. His touch was warm against her cold skin. He did not say anything else. He just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw all the lonely miles, all the unspoken hopes, all the quiet strength he possessed. And then he leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss as quiet and gentle as the moonlit snow. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and a deep, steady kindness. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment. His eyes closed. The world was still. A small drift of snow fell from the roof with a soft whoosh. In that one simple, chaste kiss, a whole new world had been born. The spell was broken the next morning by the sound of shouting. A man was struggling through the deep snow on horseback, leading another horse behind him. It was their neighbor, Mr. Anderson, from the next homestead over. He finally reached the cabin, his face red from the cold and the effort. "Saw your smoke," he called out. "Wanted to make sure you folks made it through all right. Brought an extra horse. The drifts are too deep to walk." He brought news from town of collapsed roofs and stranded travelers. And then, as he was warming himself by the fire with a cup of hot coffee, he mentioned the other piece of news that was making the rounds. Old man Pritchard was busy, even in the storm, he said, shaking his head. His man of business rode out to the Jacobson place yesterday. Bought it, lock, stock, and barrel. 160 acres. Right on the creek. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Jacobson place was the next property down from hers. Silas, who had been listening quietly, straightened up. "Jacobson sold. I thought he was planning to stay." Pritchard leaned on him hard. "Anderson said, called in all his notes at once." Jacobson did not have a choice. "The strange thing is, I heard Pritchard is already looking to sell the land again. He just wants to keep the water rights for himself, wants to control the whole creek." Silas's expression hardened. The timing was too perfect. Pritchard was making his move, using the storm as cover. He looked at Catherine, and she saw a new urgency in his eyes, a flicker of a fighting spirit. The tender, quiet man of the night before was gone, replaced by a man of action. "I need to get to town," Silas said, his voice firm. "Right now." "Anderson, I will trade you a week's work for the use of that horse." "Of course, Silas, of course," the neighbor said, surprised by his intensity. Silas was already pulling on his heavy coat and his hat. He turned to Catherine, his hands briefly gripping her arms. "Do not worry," he said. "This is not over. He is not going to win." He waded through the snow to the waiting horse, swung himself into the saddle, and, with a final, determined look back at her, urged the animal forward, breaking a new trail through the deep, unmarked snow toward Sheridan. Catherine stood on the porch, her hand where he had kissed her, and watched him go. She watched until he was just a dark speck in a vast, white world. The cabin felt suddenly terribly empty, and for the first time since he had walked into her life, she was not just grateful for his presence or comforted by it. She was afraid of his absence. She wanted him to come back. The 2 days Silas was gone felt longer than the 2 years Catherine had been a widow. The cabin, once a haven during the storm, felt empty and silent. The rhythmic sound of his hammer was replaced by the anxious thumping of her own heart. She told herself he was a capable man, that he knew how to handle himself. But the image of him riding off into the vast, snow-choked wilderness was a difficult one to shake. He returned on the 3rd day, leading the borrowed horse and riding his own buckskin. He was covered in snow, his face grim with exhaustion, but his eyes held a spark of triumph. He did not say much at first, just accepted a steaming mug of coffee with a grateful nod and held his frozen hands out to the fire. Micah hovered nearby, sensing the gravity in the air, his usual stream of questions held in check. After he had thawed, Silas looked at Catherine. "I did it," he said, his voice low and tired. "I bought the Jacobson place." Catherine stared at him, unable to process the words. "Bought it, but how?" "The telegraph office was open." He explained, "I had a stake in a cattle operation down in Texas, a good one. I wired my partner, told him to sell my share and wire the money to the bank here." He took a long drink of coffee. It was enough. "But Pritchard, he would not just sell it to you." "He did not have a choice," Silas said, a grim smile touching his lips. "He was offering the land for public sale, minus the water rights. I walked into his bank and made an offer for the entire property, rights included, a cash offer, well over what he paid Jacobson for it. Silas Morrison was there, making his own deposit. He saw the whole thing. Pritchard could not refuse a public cash offer without showing his hand to the whole town. I put a deposit down. The deed will be drawn up in a week." The audacity of it, the sheer brilliant simplicity of it, left Catherine breathless. He had used Pritchard's own weapon, money, against him. He had not just reacted, he had attacked. That afternoon, Enoch Pritchard paid them a visit. He did not ride up to the cabin like a neighbor, but rather stopped his fine black buggy at the edge of the property line, as if he were inspecting a piece of livestock. He called out for Silas, his voice carrying an oily civility that did not quite mask his fury. Silas met him at the fence line, Catherine watching from the cabin doorway. Pritchard stayed in his buggy, looking down at Silas. "Mr. Whitlow," the banker began, his smile tight, a surprising turn of events. "You seem to be a man of hidden resources." "I work hard and I invest wisely," Silas replied, his voice even. "Indeed, a man like you, a man of the world, must find our quiet corner of Wyoming a bit rustic, a man with no ties, no family here. One gets to wondering how long his interest will last. New scenery can be compelling, but it can also grow tiresome. A woman, a cabin, these things can feel like an anchor to a man used to the open range." "He is talking about me," Catherine realized. "He is calling me a trap." Silas did not rise to the bait. He just stood there, his hands resting on the top rail of the fence, a picture of immovable patience. Pritchard leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I have a proposal for you. Whitlow, a business proposal. That land you have just acquired, its real value is in the water. I am prepared to offer you a very generous long-term lease for the rights to Goose Creek. It would provide you with a steady income. No work required. You could enjoy your dalliance here, and then when you are ready to move on, you would have a full pocket and no messy property entanglements." There it was, the true prize, control of the water. Silas looked at Pritchard for a long moment. Then he slowly shook his head. "I am not for rent, Pritchard, and neither is my water. I plan on starting a horse ranch. I will need that creek. Now, if that is all, you are on my side of the fence. I would thank you to leave." Pritchard's face purpled. The mask of civility slipped, revealing the raw, ugly anger beneath. "You will regret this, Cowboy. You have made a powerful enemy today." He snapped the reins, and the buggy lurched away, leaving deep, angry tracks in the snow. The victory felt precarious. They had won a battle. But Pritchard had just declared war. The first shots in that war were not fired with guns, but with whispers. It started a few days later, when Catherine went into town for supplies. The atmosphere was different. The open stares she had endured before were now replaced with furtive glances and hushed conversations that stopped the moment she drew near. It was Amelia Pritchard's work. She knew. The banker's wife had been busy, planting seeds of slander in the fertile ground of small-town gossip. She saw the woman holding court with a group of other ladies near the dressmaker's shop. As Catherine approached, Amelia's voice rose, carrying clearly in the cold air. "It is a true shame," she was saying, her expression one of theatrical pity. "A poor, helpless widow, a lonely cowboy with a pocket full of money. It is an old story. Some women are simply masters of a certain kind of persuasion. A few hot meals, a few well-shed tears. It seems that is all it takes to trap a husband these days." The other women tittered. Catherine's face burned with a hot, furious shame. The woman in the mercantile, begging for credit, would have withered under such an attack. She would have fled. But Catherine was not that woman anymore. Something inside her, hardened by desperation and fortified by Silas's quiet strength, refused to break. She walked directly up to the group, stopping in front of Amelia Pritchard. The other women fell silent, their eyes wide. "Amelia," Catherine said, her voice low but carrying the clear, hard ring of truth. "You know nothing of my tears, and you know nothing of the state of my table. You see a widow and a kind man, and your mind, it seems, can only imagine one thing. But what I see is a woman so insecure in her own husband's wealth that she must tear down others to feel important. Mr. Whitlow is a good and honorable man. He helped me because he saw a need. Something your husband seems to see only as an opportunity for profit. I will not have you speak of him, or of me, in that manner. My life is my own, and my dignity is not for sale, and it is certainly not yours to tarnish." She held Amelia's gaze for a long, silent moment. The banker's wife, for once, was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a stranded fish. Catherine then turned, without another word, and walked away, the silence of the street her shield and her vindication. That evening, she told Silas what had happened. He listened, his hands clenched into tight fists. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. Then he turned to her, his face set with a deep resolve. "We should get married," he said. The words dropped into the quiet cabin. As startling and unexpected as a gunshot, Catherine stared at him, her heart leaping into her throat. He saw the shock on her face and hurried to explain. "Not because of them," he said, his voice earnest. "Not because of the gossip. I do not care what they say. But I care about you and Micah. I care about the life we are starting to build here. I told you I needed a reason to stay. You are the reason. Catherine, I bought that land for us. I want a home. I want a family. I have not had one for a very long time. I am asking you to marry me, not to quiet the town, but because I believe, because I have come to love you." He had said it, the word she had been too afraid to even think. Love. He was offering it to her, a gift more precious and terrifying than any amount of food or money. Her mind reeled. It was too fast. It was a reaction to Pritchard, to the pressure of the town. Her old fears, her ingrained caution, rose up in a panicked wave. But then she looked at him. She saw the absolute sincerity in his eyes. She saw the man who had filled her empty basket, who had taught her son how to set a snare, who had fixed her roof and guarded her honor. She saw the man who had kissed her so gently in the moonlight. This was not a decision born of fear or necessity. Her heart, which she had thought was broken and buried with Thomas, was beating with a new, strong rhythm. It was beating for him. "Yes," she whispered, the word a quiet breath of surrender and hope. "Yes, Silas, I will marry you." The days leading up to the wedding were a strange mixture of quiet joy and rising tension. One afternoon, Catherine saw two men on horseback down by the creek, near the border between her land and the newly purchased Jacobson place. They had a surveyor's chain and were driving wooden stakes into the ground. Pritchard's men. Silas went down to speak with them. He came back a short while later, a thoughtful, troubled look on his face. "They are marking the boundary line," he said. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "I'm not sure," he said slowly. "I do not know this land well enough yet, but it seems to me those stakes are awfully close to the creek bank, closer than they should be. It feels like they are claiming more of the creek's edge than the old maps would show." He had no proof, nothing to go on but a feeling. But Catherine knew he was right. It was another of Pritchard's quiet aggressions, a subtle theft being committed in plain sight. It was a problem for another day, a battle yet to come. For now, there was another, more important matter at hand. They were married on a Saturday, in a small, whitewashed church a few miles outside of town. It was not a grand affair. The only witnesses were Dr. Harrison and his wife, and their neighbor, Mr. Anderson. Catherine wore her best dress, a simple blue calico she had mended herself. Silas wore a clean shirt and a string tie, looking both uncomfortable and profoundly happy. Micah stood between them before the minister, his small hand holding one of Catherine's and one of Silas's. When the minister asked who gave this woman to be married to this man, Micah looked up at Silas, his eyes shining with a child's pure and simple truth. "I give you my mother," he said, his voice clear and steady. A wave of emotion washed over Catherine, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. This was not just a marriage. It was the forging of a family, a small, defiant circle of three against a hard and unforgiving world. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Silas did not kiss her with passion, but with a deep, reverent tenderness. He kissed her as if she were something precious, something he had been searching for his entire life. They walked out of the small church and into the bright, cold sunlight, the three of them, their hands linked. The happiness Catherine felt was not a light, fleeting thing. It had weight, it had substance, it was real. It was a foundation, solid and true, upon which they would build a life. Moving from the small, familiar cabin to the Jacobson place was like taking a deep breath after being underwater. The house was larger, with 2 proper bedrooms and a wide front porch that looked out over 160 acres of gently rolling pasture land. It was neglected, the paint peeling and the corrals in need of mending, but it was solid, a place with good bones and a future. They began to call it the Whitlow Ranch, and the name itself felt like an act of creation, a claim staked not just on the land, but on a new life. The work was hard, but it was a joyful labor. Together, they chinked the mortar between the logs of the main house, their hands often brushing, their laughter echoing in the crisp spring air. Silas, with Micah as his ever-present shadow, rebuilt the sagging barn and erected new fences, his movements sure and strong. He was building the framework of his dream, and Catherine could see the deep satisfaction it brought him, a quiet contentment that settled in his eyes. Catherine, for her part, claimed the house as her own. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards shone and hung new calico curtains in the windows. On a whim, she used the last of their savings to buy a can of bright blue paint. She spent an entire afternoon painting the front door, the color a defiant splash of hope against the weathered gray logs. "It is for good luck," she told Silas when he came in from the fields. "Tired and dusty, a blue door keeps the bad spirits away." Silas smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his serious face. He reached out and touched the still tacky paint with his finger, then gently touched that finger to her cheek. leaving a small blue mark. "Well then," he said, his voice soft, "I reckon we will be the luckiest folks in Wyoming." She started a garden in a protected patch of earth behind the house, her hands sinking into the rich, dark soil with a feeling of profound homecoming. She was planting roots, both literally and figuratively, as the first green shoots of beans and squash pushed their way toward the sun. She felt a corresponding sense of hope unfurling in her own heart. In early May, Silas brought home the first of his horses, a small band of sturdy, intelligent mares he had bought from a rancher over the mountains. Watching him with the animals was like watching a musician with his instrument. He moved among them with a quiet confidence, his voice low and soothing, his hands gentle. He was in his element, a man who had found his purpose. The ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It had a heartbeat. The arrival of Silas's sister, Rose, and her 2 young children in early June brought a new kind of life to the ranch. They arrived in a dusty, rattling wagon, a whirlwind of noise and laughter and joyful chaos. Rose was a stout, capable woman with her brother's kind eyes and a direct, no-nonsense manner. Her children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5, were a boisterous, happy pair who immediately adopted Micah into their fold. For Catherine, who had lived for so long in a world of quiet anxiety, the sudden presence of a larger family was both overwhelming and wonderful. The house was filled with the sounds of children's games and Rose's hearty laugh. The table was crowded at every meal. It was messy and loud and utterly alive. She found herself leaning on Rose's practical wisdom, sharing stories and worries as they shelled peas on the front porch or mended clothes by the fire in the evenings. It was during one of these quiet evenings, with the children finally asleep and the men outside discussing a problem with the new well, that Rose gave Catherine the final piece of the puzzle that was Silas Whitlow. "He is a good man, Catherine," Rose said, her needle flashing in the lamplight, "the best I have ever known. But he did not come by it easy." She paused, her expression growing somber. "Our father, he was a hard man. He had a temper that was like a summer storm, quick to rise and destructive. He believed that the world was a hard place, and the only way to survive it was to be harder. He ruled our house with his fists." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined such a thing. Silas was so gentle, so controlled. Silas took the worst of it. Rose continued, her voice low. "He was older. He was always trying to stand between our father and me, or our mother. He learned young how to be quiet, how to watch, how to see a storm coming before it broke. He learned that a loud voice and a heavy hand were not strength, but a kind of poison. He swore he would never be that man. He has spent his whole life trying to build things, to protect things, because we grew up in a world where everything felt like it was on the verge of being broken." Rose looked at Catherine, her eyes full of a fierce, protective love for her brother. "When he rode into Sheridan and saw you, standing on that boardwalk with your empty basket and your little boy, he was not just seeing a stranger in need of a meal. He was seeing a story he knew by heart, and he was finally in a position to change the ending." The confession settled deep in Catherine's heart, illuminating the last dark corners of her understanding. His quiet strength, his fierce protectiveness, his deep-seated need to build and mend. It all made sense. Her love for him, already a strong and steady flame, deepened into something fierce and absolute. The peace of that summer was shattered by a letter, delivered by the same boy on the pony who had brought Pritchard's first summons. This one was from a law office in Cheyenne, written on behalf of Mr. Enoch Pritchard. The language was dense and convoluted, but the meaning was clear. Pritchard was claiming that a historical survey, dating back to the earliest days of the territory, granted him an easement across Catherine's original 80-acre homestead. He was threatening to sue for the right to build an access road and an irrigation ditch from the main road straight to Goose Creek, effectively cutting her property in half. The threat was a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of their new life, while they now lived on the Whitlow Ranch. Catherine's original homestead was vital. It was their best pasture land, the place where they planned to graze the horses in the winter. A road and a ditch would make it useless. Silas read the letter, his face hardening into a granite mask. He is lying. There is no such survey. He is inventing it, hoping to scare us into selling him the rights. That evening, they rode into town. Silas convened a small, urgent meeting in the back room of the blacksmith's shop. Dr. Harrison was there, his spectacles perched on his nose as he carefully read the lawyer's letter. Silas Morrison, the mercantile owner, came as well, his face etched with worry. The blacksmith, a burly man named Smithy, whose opinion was widely respected, stood with his arms crossed, listening intently. "It is a bluff," Dr. Harrison said, finally looking up. "The legal language is intentionally vague. He cites a document but does not provide a copy. He is trying to drown you in paper, hoping you will panic." "But he could sue us," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. "We do not have the money to fight a lawsuit in Cheyenne." "That is what he is counting on," Smithy said, his voice a low rumble. "It is the same tactic he used on the Miller family and the widow Jensen. Squeezed them with their credit at the store, then threatened them with legal action they could not afford. They both sold out to him for next to nothing. He is trying to lock up all the water along this creek." Water was everything. Without free and open access to the creek, the grass would not grow for hay. Without hay, they could not feed the horses through the winter. Without horses, there was no ranch. Pritchard was not just trying to take a piece of their land. He was trying to steal their future. "We need to stand together," Morrison said, his voice surprisingly firm. He looked at Silas and Catherine, his eyes full of a long simmering guilt. "I was a part of the problem. I let Pritchard use my ledgers to put the squeeze on people. I was afraid of him, but I am more afraid of what this town will become if men like him are allowed to write all the rules. We need to call a community meeting. We need to let everyone know what he is doing." The decision was made. The fight would be brought out into the open. That night, after they returned to the ranch, Silas sat at the kitchen table long after Catherine and the family had gone to bed, by the light of a single oil lamp. He spread out all of their papers, the deed to the Jacobson place, the title to Catherine's homestead, and the original loan agreement from Pritchard's bank for the seed money Thomas had borrowed. He stared at the documents, searching for something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. His eyes kept coming back to the bank ledger page that detailed Catherine's debt, a copy of which Pritchard had given her during their meeting. He compared it to the original loan agreement Thomas had signed. Most of it matched. But there was something about an entry near the bottom, a notation about collateral, written in a slightly different hand, the ink a fraction of a shade darker than the rest. It was a tiny discrepancy, almost unnoticeable, but in the deep, quiet hours of the night, it felt like a single, sharp note of discord in an otherwise perfect lie. He could not prove anything yet, but a cold certainty began to form in his gut. The books had been altered. As the days shortened and the brief, glorious Wyoming summer began to fade, a new worry emerged. It had not rained for weeks. The sky remained a vast, empty bowl of blue. The grass in the pastures, which should have been thick and green, was turning a brittle, dusty brown. The air grew hot and dry, and the wind that blew across the plains carried the scent of dust and desolation. At night, Silas would stand on the blue-painted porch, his face turned to the west, his nostrils flared, sniffing the wind not for the promise of rain, but for the first, faint, telltale scent of smoke. The land was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark, and Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that a man as ruthless as Enoch Pritchard was more than capable of providing one. The first sign of trouble was not a sight but a smell, carried on the hot, dry wind from the east. It was a sharp, acrid scent that scraped the back of the throat, the smell of burning grass and old wood. Silas was on the porch, mending a bridle. When he caught it, he went still, his head lifting like a deer sensing a predator. He rose and walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes narrowed, scanning the hazy horizon. "It is Anderson's place," he said, his voice a low, grim rumble. Catherine and Rose came out of the house, the children trailing behind them, their faces clouded with a shared unease. In the distance, a thin column of dark gray smoke was beginning to billow into the otherwise flawless blue sky. The wind shifted, a sudden, malevolent gust from the southeast, and the column of smoke seemed to bend and stretch, pointing directly toward them. Silas cursed under his breath. "It is coming this way, and it is moving fast." There was no time for discussion, no time for fear. Action was the only currency that had value. "Rose, you and Catherine get the children in the root cellar. Take water, blankets, and whatever food you can grab. Soak the blankets in water and put them over the cellar door. Micah, you are the man of the house down there. You keep everyone calm." He was already moving, his long strides eating up the ground as he ran toward the barn to release the horses into the far pasture, away from the buildings. Rose and Catherine worked in a frantic but efficient silence. Their movements a practiced dance of domesticity turned to desperate preparation. They herded the frightened children, their faces pale and their eyes wide, down the dark, earthy-smelling steps of the root cellar. Just as Catherine was about to pull the heavy wooden doors shut, she saw riders coming hard from the direction of town. It was a small group of men, Smithy, the blacksmith, in the lead, with Morrison and Dr. Harrison right behind him, along with a handful of other ranchers and townsfolk. They had seen the smoke. In a land this dry, fire was everyone's enemy. By the time the men reached the ranch, the smoke was a roiling, angry cloud, and the leading edge of the fire was a terrifying orange line devouring the brown prairie grass a mile away. The roar was audible now, a sound like a constant, angry waterfall. "We have to backfire," Smithy shouted over the wind and the noise. "Burn a line they cannot cross." It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. They would be fighting fire with fire, trying to create a wide, black scar of burned land that the main blaze would not be able to jump. Silas, his face smeared with soot, took charge of the men nearest the house and barn. They worked with a terrifying urgency, dragging wet horse blankets to beat at the flames they intentionally set, controlling their own small fire to create a protective barrier. The heat was an oppressive, physical force, stealing the air from their lungs. Embers, carried on the wind, rained down like fiery insects, starting small spot fires that had to be stamped out immediately. Silas was everywhere at once, his voice a calm, steady command in the chaos, directing the men, his experience on the open range an invaluable asset. At one point, a sudden gust of wind whipped a section of their backfire out of control, a flaming serpent that lashed out toward the barn, without a thought for his own safety. Silas plunged into the smoke, using a water-soaked burlap sack to beat at the base of the flames. He saved the barn, but when he emerged, his hands were red and blistered, the skin seared by the intense heat. He barely seemed to notice, his focus absolute. Inside the root cellar, Catherine held the younger children close, their small bodies trembling. Micah, however, was pressed against a small crack between the cellar doors, peering out at the hellish landscape. He could see the men, dark, frantic shapes moving through the thick, acrid smoke. He could see the terrifying beauty of the flames. And then he saw something else. Away from the main fire, near the creek that marked the boundary of their land, he saw two men. They were not fighting the fire. They were carrying wooden stakes and a heavy mallet. In the confusing, flickering light of the flames, they were moving with a furtive haste, pulling up the old boundary stakes and driving new ones into the ground. Several feet closer to the water's edge, they were stealing their land, using the fire as a cover for their crime. Micah recognized them as two of the rough men who sometimes worked for Enoch Pritchard. For a moment, fear paralyzed him. He was just a boy. These were grown men, and they were doing something bad. But then he thought of Silas, his new father, fighting the fire, his face grim with determination. He thought of his mother, her quiet strength a shield around him. This was their home. These men were trying to take it. He scrambled away from the door. "Mama," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Mama, you have to come. Mr. Pritchard's men. They are moving the fences." Catherine's blood ran cold. She looked from Micah's terrified, earnest face to the sliver of fiery light visible through the crack in the door. She made a decision. She handed the youngest Anderson child to Rose. "Keep them safe," she said. She pushed open the cellar door and scrambled out into the smoke-filled twilight. The main fire had passed them, leaving a blackened, smoldering landscape. But the air was still thick and hard to breathe. The men were exhausted, leaning on their shovels and makeshift brooms, their face black with soot. Silas was having his burned hands gently wrapped in a clean cloth by Dr. Harrison. "Silas," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the weary silence. "Pritchard's men, they were just at the creek. Micah saw them moving the boundary stakes." A new kind of energy surged through the exhausted group. This was not a natural disaster. This was a man-made one. Silas, his jaw tight with a cold fury, stood up. "Let us go and see." They walked as a group, a small, soot-stained army, toward the creek. Dr. Harrison, Smithy, Morrison, and the Anderson patriarch followed Silas and Catherine. And there, by the water's edge, were the two men just finishing their work. They looked up, startled, their faces a mixture of guilt and defiance as the group of landowners approached. "That is far enough," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying a deadly authority. "You are on my land." "This is the boundary line," one of the men sneered, gesturing to the freshly driven stake, "set by the county surveyor." "That is a lie," Catherine said, stepping forward. "We saw you. My son saw you move them." The man laughed. "The word of a boy against a legal survey? I do not think so." "It is not just the word of a boy," Silas said. He began to speak, not of deeds or papers, but of the unwritten law of the West, of customary use and the rights of the first settler to the water. He spoke of how a community respected a man's property, how lines were drawn by mutual agreement and honored for generations. It was then that Silas Morrison stepped forward, a large, leather-bound book held in his hands. It was his store ledger. "A survey can be wrong," Morrison said, his voice shaking but clear, "and so can a bank's ledger, but it is harder for them to lie when you look at them in the right light." He opened the book to a specific page. "This is the record of Catherine Hale's debt to my store, a debt Enoch Pritchard bought from me. And this," he said, pointing to a copy of the bank's record that Silas had obtained, "is the bank's version. They look the same, but they are not." He held the two pages side by side. He pointed to the notation about collateral that Silas had noticed. "The ink," he said. "Look at the ink. It is a different shade, and the handwriting is different. I have done business with the bank for 10 years. I know the hand of every clerk who has ever worked there. This was written by John Cartwright, Pritchard's nephew, and it was added long after the original loan was made. This document is a forgery." A stunned silence fell over the group. The two hired men looked at each other, their bravado gone. "And there is more," Smithy the blacksmith said. He walked to a large, old cottonwood tree that stood a few feet back from the creek, its bark scarred but its trunk solid. He ran his hand over the bark. "Before Jacobson sold this place, he and I ran the fence line together. We marked the corner post right here." He pointed to a small, weathered X, nearly invisible, carved deep into the wood. It was a good 10 feet back from the new stake Pritchard's men had just driven. It was irrefutable. Physical proof. Physical. The community had its evidence. The law they chose to enact was swift and decisive. "Pull up those stakes," Smithy said to the two men, his voice a low growl. "Now." The men, seeing the hard, determined look on the faces of the ranchers, did not argue. They sullenly pulled the stakes from the soft earth of the creek bank. Dr. Harrison, meanwhile, was already writing. Using the back of a piece of paper from his medical bag, he drafted a statement, a sworn affidavit of what had transpired, detailing the forged ledger and the true boundary mark on the tree, one by one. Every man present, including a shamefaced but resolute Silas Morrison, signed their name to it. Community justice, clear and undeniable. They returned to the devastation of the ranch as true night fell. The fire had burned itself out against the mountains, but the air was still thick with the smell of ash. The Anderson homestead, which had been directly in the fire's path, was gone. Nothing was left but a stone chimney, standing like a lonely tombstone against the star-filled sky. The Anderson family stood huddled together, their faces blank with shock, their children shivering in the cooling air. Catherine's heart broke for them. She looked at their blackened, empty fields, at the faces of their hungry, frightened children, and she remembered another time, another empty container, another moment of absolute desperation. She walked to where Mrs. Anderson was trying to comfort her youngest child. She put a hand on the woman's shoulder, and then, her voice clear and steady in the desolate quiet, she spoke the 5 words that had once saved her. "Come with me. We will fill your table tonight." She led the stunned, silent family toward the blue door of her own undamaged house, a small beacon of light and warmth in the vast, smoldering darkness. Enoch Pritchard had not been defeated, not entirely. The threat of a lawsuit in Cheyenne still hung in the air, but on this night, on the burned-over prairie, a different kind of victory had been won. It was not a victory of law or money, but of courage, community, and the simple, powerful grace of a full table offered in a time of need. The ashes of the fire had barely cooled before the work of healing began. The following morning, a small army of neighbors descended on the blackened remains of the Anderson homestead. They came not with condolences, but with hammers, saws, and a stubborn, communal determination. Smithy, his powerful arms directing the work, organized the men into teams. They salvaged what they could, clearing the charred debris and laying the foundations for a new, temporary cabin that would see the Andersons through the coming winter. The women, led by Dr. Harrison's capable wife, set up a makeshift kitchen under a canvas tarp, keeping a massive pot of coffee brewing and serving stew and bread to the work crews. They sorted through the Andersons' few salvaged possessions, their quiet, practical sympathy a far greater comfort than any words could have been. Catherine, with Rose by her side, worked tirelessly, her heart full. She saw in the shared labor, in the easy camaraderie of people bound by a common purpose, the true meaning of wealth. It was not something a man could hoard in a bank. It was something you built, hand in hand, with your neighbors. A few days into the rebuilding effort, a fine black buggy pulled up the road, a sight that caused a tense silence to fall over the work site. But it was not Enoch Pritchard who stepped out. It was Amelia. She was dressed plainly, without her usual furs and finery. She looked smaller, somehow, and uncertain. She did not approach the main group, but stood hesitantly by her buggy, her eyes searching for Catherine. Catherine wiped her hands on her apron and went to meet her, her expression neutral. The other woman's face was pale, and for the first time, Catherine saw not a villain, but a woman who looked lost and afraid. "Catherine," Amelia began, her voice low, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Catherine's shoulder. I came to offer my apologies." "For what, specifically?" Amelia Catherine asked, not unkindly, but unwilling to make it easy for her. "For the gossip, for the insults." "For all of it," Amelia said, her voice cracking slightly. "And for what my husband, for what he tried to do, I did not know about the fire, I swear it. When I heard what had happened at the creek, the forged papers, he has gone too far. This is not the man I married. Or perhaps it is, and I simply refuse to see it." She finally met Catherine's eyes, and in their depths, Catherine saw a flicker of genuine shame. "My husband sought to build an empire of land and money. He has ended up with nothing but a legacy of fear and hatred. You and your husband, you have built something real here. I am sorry for trying to tear it down." She did not wait for a response. She turned, her back stiff, and climbed back into her buggy, driving away without a backward glance. It was not a perfect apology, not a promise of a changed heart, but it was a beginning. It was an admission of defeat. Catherine watched her go, feeling not triumph, but a quiet, weary pity. The seasons turned, the first snows of winter fell, blanketing the new roof of the Andersons' cabin and the healing, blackened prairie. The winter was long and cold, but inside the Whitlow ranch house, there was warmth and life. In the spring, as the first crocuses pushed their way through the melting snow, Catherine gave birth to a daughter, a beautiful, healthy baby with Silas's calm gray eyes and a fuzz of dark hair. They named her Sarah Rose. Holding the tiny, perfect child in her arms, Catherine felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was the true harvest. This was the reason for all the struggle, for all the fear. It was the future, held safe in her arms. Years later, a son would follow, a boy they would name Thomas, for a dreamer who had loved this land first. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable, prosperous rhythm. Silas's reputation as a horseman grew, and he took on 2 young, eager apprentices, teaching them the quiet, patient language of horses, just as he had once taught Micah the language of the wild. Catherine, with her quick mind and steady hand, took over the ranch's books, her neat columns of figures a testament to their growing success. Her garden flourished, and her flock of chickens kept their table, and the Andersons supplied with fresh eggs. Micah grew tall and strong, his boyish frame filling out with the hard, healthy work of the ranch. He rode as if he had been born in the saddle, and in the evenings, he would sit with Catherine, his head bent over a book, his brow furrowed in concentration as she taught him to read. He was a quiet, thoughtful boy, with his mother's resilience and Silas's steady heart. The final piece of their past fell into place one summer afternoon, with a letter from Cheyenne. It was an official-looking document, bearing the seal of the territorial court. Silas opened it with his burned, scarred hands, his face impassive. He read it aloud, his voice calm and even. The court, citing the long-established customs of prior use and the sworn testimony of nearly a dozen of their neighbors, had ruled in their favor. The water rights to Goose Creek belonged to the properties it flowed through, not to the man who owned the bank. As a final note, the letter mentioned that Mr. Enoch Pritchard had been assessed a fine for the willful alteration of financial documents. The fine was small, a token punishment, but in a town like Sheridan, the public humiliation was a far greater blow. Enoch Pritchard's power, built on a foundation of intimidation and deceit, had been irrevocably broken, not by a greater power, but by the collective courage of ordinary people. That evening, to celebrate, Silas gave Catherine a gift. It was a beautiful, leather-bound journal, the cover smooth and smelling of rich, cured hide. On the first page, in his careful, blocky script, he had written a short inscription. It read simply, "For Catherine, from empty baskets to full tables, all my love, Silas." Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the words with her finger. It was the story of their life together, written in 5 perfect words. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table by the light of a single lamp. She opened the journal, dipped a pen in a pot of ink, and began to write. Her first sentence came to her not as a memory, but as a living, breathing truth that was the foundation of everything that followed. I stood outside the mercantile with an empty basket, and the wind had teeth. A year passed. It was a warm evening in late summer, the kind of evening where the setting sun bathes the world in a thick, golden light. Catherine stood on the porch of their home, the blue door a cheerful, welcoming beacon. Sarah Rose was asleep in her cradle just inside, and the comforting smell of baking bread drifted from the warm kitchen. In the main corral, Silas was working with the 2 apprentices, his voice a low, patient murmur as he demonstrated how to gentle a young colt. Micah was there too, perched on the top rail of the fence, watching his father with a look of quiet adoration, offering his own solemn, 6-year-old advice. The sound of their laughter, deep and boyish, drifted across the yard, mingling with the soft nickering of the horses and the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. Catherine leaned against the porch railing, a gentle smile on her face, and felt a wave of pure, uncomplicated happiness wash over her. This was the life they had built, not with money or power, but with calloused hands, stubborn hearts, and a fierce, unwavering belief in each other. Happiness, she had learned, did not erase the scars of the past, the memory of hunger, the sting of humiliation, the terror of the fire. They were all a part of her story, but they were no longer the whole story. They were just the first chapter in a much longer, richer book. The future was here, in the sound of her husband's voice, in the silhouette of her son against the setting sun, in the peaceful sleep of the baby in the next room, and in the enduring life-giving promise of a full table in a warm and loving home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from in the world to connect and share your thoughts. And remember to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so our story can be heard by more people.